Plaza. Okay, we go to Ashbury Park, New Jersey, and Emily's going to take us there, and we're going to be looking at a town center.
Is it on? No? Yeah? All right. There we go. Hi, my name is Emily Broxmeyer. Before we take a ride up the turnpike, I would like to say thank you to everyone who has helped me along the way. All of my friends, my family, and my committee, especially my chair, Peter Noonan, and Carl DeQuaid, for all of their help and guidance along the way. It's been a fantastic experience. So with that, I would like to introduce social infrastructure, creating a community place to bridge an urban divide. Just to go quickly through the layout, we're going to look at the larger issue, then dive into the site in Asbury Park, and finally diving into the design. So, although this thesis is focused in Asbury Park, New Jersey, there is this issue throughout the country and throughout the world of railroads being an urban divider, so dividing spaces, dividing cities, and dividing communities. So, although railroads act as connectors at the national and regional scale, connecting cities and connecting people, in New Jersey, connecting the kind of suburb area of all of New Jersey to Manhattan and Philadelphia. At the urban scale, these railroads really act to divide the communities. This can be seen in demographics, in income, and we'll take a dive into that in Asbury Park. So many have heard the idiom, the wrong side of the tracks, and this comes from the idea that these western winds blew the smoke from coal-powered trains to the east side of the train tracks, creating a more undesirable environment and a wrong side. And that's really continued even as train technology developed. So you can see this in these aerials from different parts of the world. There's just this stark difference between two sides of the tracks. So what's the solution? Through travels and studying in Europe and Scandinavia, I really gained an appreciation for public space. Public space that brought people together, especially the public plaza. So looking at examples in Copenhagen, in Helsinki, and in my home away from home of Florence, looking at these piazzas and how me as a visitor, I could go in and really experience the city and the daily life of its residents. And appreciate, how they go about their daily life and integrate myself into that. And how as part of the community they can come together in these spaces. Another function that did that, in my eyes, was markets. So looking at food markets in London, in Stockholm, all these places that I was fortunate enough to visit, and I was able to dive into the local cuisine, dive into the local culture, and it also acted as an amenity for this community. So why Asbury Park? Why New Jersey, right? I am from New Jersey, but also it has a lot of great benefits. So again, looking at the placement and the accessibility to Manhattan by a rail track, a commuter rail, and to Philadelphia by a bus route. So the train from New York to the north continues down 6 stops past Asbury Park, but Asbury Park really is the largest city along that route, and the bus from Philadelphia stops in Asbury Park, so that's the final destination. And then throughout the city, there is the train line, there are local NJ Transit bus routes, as well as a circulator bringing visitors from the train station to the beach. There's also these regional resources. It's the Garden State, so there's tons of amazing produce and these farmers markets scattered throughout a lot of the suburbs, but they're mostly pulled away from the shoreline. So looking at how you can use these regional assets and really show that off from the start of someone's visit. On the less happy note, there is this very stark divide in the community that happens at the rail. So you can see that in the difference in income, the difference in home value, and the difference in employment rates. And this divide really started from the founding of the city. The side east of the existing train tracks was developed as a resort town, and developed all these amenities for the resort town, amusement parks, beautiful buildings. But to the west of the tracks at this time, it was really developed as a place for the people serving the east side of the tracks, which that divide can still be seen today. The growth continued through the 1920s when the city's landmark buildings that I'll dive into in a few minutes were built mostly along the boardwalk and primarily on the east side of the tracks. It was until 1947 that the city started to decline. That was sparked by the building of the the Garden State Parkway, as well as the Monmouth County Mall, which brought people away from the rail line, away from the shoreline, and brought the commercial businesses out of the city. So it also went through a hard time in 1970, like many cities in America, when race riots burned down the commercial street on the west side of the tracks in Springwood Avenue.
Sorry, you were going through a lot of images that are really compelling. Can you just give us some idea where these are?
Springwood Avenue is right here.
Okay. And that's the aerial view of that?
That, yes. Looking towards the shore. Yeah. So the growth or the decline continued through almost currently. In the 1970s, a lot of the buildings were demolished or taken out of commission. The carousel was sold, the amusement park was torn down, and in 2007, a little more recently, the casino building that was located on the beach was torn down because it just couldn't stand up anymore. Then, as many of us remember, in 2012, Hurricane Sandy hit and really devastated the New Jersey shoreline. Asbury Park was this was almost the spark of the development of Asbury Park because it was one of the first cities to rebuild the boardwalk, redevelop, and reopen in 2013. So it really sparked this stronger than the storm movement in on the Jersey Shore that raised a lot of money to rehabilitate these towns. Looking at these architectural landmarks that were built in the 20s, there's buildings that bookend the Asbury Park Boardwalk. That's the convention center, the casino building. So the building that was torn down was over here, and now it just stands as a gateway over the boardwalk. The carousel building and the steam plant, those are sort of the iconic Asbury Park buildings, as well as down Cookman Avenue, which is this commercial street. You have Press Plaza and the post office. Asbury Park has a really strong sense of culture. It's something that's really important to the community. There's shirts and signs everywhere that say "Keep Asbury Park Weird," and they're really known for their art and their music. So the Stone Pony, which is where Bruce Springsteen got his start with his album Greetings from Asbury Park, which kind of put the city on the map, is located alongside the boardwalk, as well as the boardwalk being the main feature in the city. New development is happening really rapidly right now. It's going through what many call its renaissance. So developers from New York and locally are investing tons of money into the town, but almost all of that investment is happening on the east side of the tracks. So a new super high-end, super expensive hotel and residence are happening all along here. And then actually a few weeks ago, 2 new housing developments were approved for the west side of the tracks, which is a really great thing to see. As far as community resources, most of the resources are religious or educational. There are 3 community buildings, but they're small and don't really service both sides of the train tracks. And there are these 3 urban corridors of Cookman Avenue, Main Street, and Springwood Avenue that are undergoing redevelopment and really highlight the important streets in the city. The current site is located alongside this lake with a train station, a strip mall, and a municipal building that is slotted for demolition because it's just not functioning properly. To the west, you see a lot of vacant lots and a lot of housing projects, while to the east, you see these commercial buildings and these more historic structures. So looking at the urban design approach, really focusing on these 3 urban corridors was kind of the first move of Cookman Avenue leading to Main Street and Springwood Avenue, and having this site as sort of the knuckle of that shift. So having that act as kind of the catalyst for development on the west side of the tracks is really important in shifting people from Springwood Avenue to Cookman Avenue and vice versa. And figuring out a way to connect these 2 sides was really imperative. So the beginning of the problem starts from the fact that this block was 3 blocks long and really divided the city because there wasn't a way to cross. That's heightened by the fact that these platforms are raised 51 inches above grade. So the tracks are at grade, but the platform is 51 inches tall and spanned that whole length. So the first logical move was cutting these streets through again to reconnect the city grid. And then you kind of get these 3 options of under the tracks, over the tracks, or around the tracks. Moving forward with the idea of bridging under the tracks, expanding that tunnel to create a public plaza, creates a public space that really connects these 2 sides of the city. Moving forward by putting community buildings and public-oriented buildings along this plaza keeps the plaza active, as well as bringing people down Cookman Avenue and around to Springwood Avenue. Shifting the train was a big move. This allowed for, instead of having 2 separate platforms, 1 central platform was created in order to bring everyone into one space. Whether you are a visitor, whether you're going into New York or further down the shoreline, everyone comes to this one space. Looking at the circulation down into this space to make sure that that is not only universally accessible, but a really special experience that can be used as different functions. And finally, looking at putting this canopy over the entire platform that really expresses this unifying element, what is now a unifying element at the street level. So creating a public facade for this train. And that brings us into the final design. So I'd like to shift your attention to the boards, and there will be key plans for the views up on the screen. So starting from the west, we have a library that anchors the space. Going across Memorial Drive, there is a public plaza, amphitheater space leading under the train tracks into the plaza on the east side. So this plaza really, it's not an east and a west plaza, it's one plaza that connects under the tracks. So if you are living in West Asbury Park and you're commuting into New York, you would come across Memorial Drive. There's 2 apartment buildings on the north and south of this plaza that have live-work units as well as retail space on the ground floor. At the plaza level, these 2 buildings connect with community spaces that can be flexible and really serve to connect these 2 buildings. Outside of that space on the plaza level is an amphitheater that really creates an active space on the west side. So this can be used for street performances, for movies, for events, and then you would move on to the central platform and go to wherever your destination might be, looking over at this plaza. And as a visitor, getting off of the train on this platform, you would see all this activity happening in the plazas and really be enticed to be part of that activity. So you would move down through this central elevator that also acts as a beacon or one of the staircases on either end, and come into the under-track gallery. So using these structural walls that hold the train up as a gallery space for the street artists that are really present throughout the entire city. Almost every building in the city has beautiful murals by local artists. So really expressing that from the start of your visit in Asbury Park was really important to me. Moving into the East Plaza, you see that it's a really open, flexible space bound by these 2 buildings where pop-up markets can happen, concerts, maybe you get off the train and there's a concert happening and you're already part of that experience. Moving forward, the plaza on the east side of the tracks is anchored on the north and south by a market building and an arts center, which serve as enclosed gathering spaces where the city's culture of great food, beautiful art, music, entertainment can really be seen and experienced. And these are all very permeable at the ground, at the plaza level, in order to encourage circulation across this plaza space. Also taking into account having classrooms and studios in that art space to serve the community, and a gallery above. Finally, didn't press the button. So finally, the canopy that connects these structures really was taken from the street grid itself. Well, it was inspired from it. So the street grid, you can see on the screen, flares out towards the ocean in order to capture those ocean breezes. And that Y shape kind of manifested itself in the columns that hold this canopy up and create a public facade for the train. So not only does it take from kind of what is happening at the urban scale, but it creates this dynamic facade for this train, so it's not just kind of a platform going through space, and announces its presence. So in conclusion, creating these community spaces that actually bridge across the tracks and under the tracks, that are bound by community-oriented spaces and hyper-social spaces, can create a space that's not only encouraging movement from one side to another, but actually serving as a gathering space for visitors, for residents from each side of the city to come together. And with that, I'd like to open for comments and questions.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Is the library your intervention?
Yes, it is my intervention. It wasn't designed in detail, but having an anchor on the west side of the space was important.
I really appreciate the sort of civic quality of things. Even the sort of monumental columns, you really made it have that tie to the infrastructure. But this is a special place beyond the need to just get down, under, and back up. So really, really very nice. And the fact that you actually made a canopy to establish a sense of train station. Great moves.
Thank you.
I guess I agree. I think the site planning I like. And the transit plaza that you created, I think is nice. I wish you'd given us a little bit more on the 4 buildings that you had created, because as I look at this, I was trying to wrap my head around, aside from the sections, which again I think are kind of compelling. I don't know, can you talk a little bit more about like why the brick at the lower level, why the columns kind of coming down, why the architectural language that you've used for the actual buildings themselves, aside from the train platform?
Yeah, so I actually thought a lot about that public face of these, because this brick and the strong columns actually take from these landmark buildings that are part of Asbury Park's history and their culture, and buildings that they really pride themselves in. Similar to the convention center, there is this red brick that's also seen throughout the city, and these large columns that kind of tie the 2 spaces together on the ground floor and the sunken plaza level was also important. Then creating these really open doorways and windows that could open up into the plaza, with screens that can close and open that are taken from the green metal that's also seen on the Asbury Park Boardwalk buildings.
I guess, sorry, we're never going to hold this microphone. I guess the comment, and the reason why I was asking that is, I think the architectural vocabulary you've used with the canopy and the overhang over the tracks is quite interesting, and I like how you tied it back to the street grid and the angles coming for that. And as I look at this lower facade, it just looks like the canopies you build with storefront entrances are not the most interesting elements designed. So you have this entire long facade which stretches your
Yeah.
so if I look at that section, which I'm not closest to, from a distance, there's so much going on down there, and it's so
Yeah.
energetic, and you put a lot of thought into the different forms, and I look at this one right here, and it's like, that's, and I don't mean this wrongly, it looks a little street mallish, like
Okay.
nothing's popping on that lower level, so that's what I was.
Yeah, yeah, I did that sort of to try and not compete too much with the facade, but I definitely agree that these facades really need to pop.
So I appreciate and agree with the comments so far. The one thing I'll challenge is the extent on the west, or sorry, yes, the west. I understand you're pinched by the street, but you've essentially put a wall up there anyway. And how lovely and nice it is to come in, you know, open on this side. Part of me says, I wonder, did you ever consider, and I know this is, you know, big question, did you ever consider closing that street and going across, going
Yes.
across and claiming that whole block as a big public green and forcing people to go around? And it is at the transition or knuckle of all these angled roads coming in. And again, I don't know that it's necessarily the right solution, but it seems pinched on this side. And I can tell you want to do something because you did the library.
Yeah.
And so it seems still uneven. And
I completely agree, and actually, for a lot of the semester, I actually moved forward with a design that bridged, well, first I moved the street back so that there was more space, and then just transportation-wise and functionality-wise, getting buses in and out, that I sort of pushed back on myself. And then I did actually at a lot of points bridge completely under that street and connect this plaza under these tracks, under that street, and into this library. And it just kind of became this monster underground.
It seems like that the library could shift up and hold the corner, and then you'd have an open space in between
In front, yeah.
that would respond to.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion.
The only other thing I would say is I love the canopy. I would like to see it stretch out almost over the roads. So as you're coming down those roads that you talked about as being kind of these strong corridors, you get to see them kind of grabbing out and
Yeah.
reaching out.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. I tried to kind of not do that, but have something pulling you along with these beacons and clock towers that would be leading down the street, but I definitely agree that that could poke itself out.
Itself out.
Yep.
I'd recommend, this is, again, it's a very difficult project. Every city that has a track is, what do you do? How do you go over it or under it? And what I'm not seeing today, and I don't know if you were told not to do this or not, but there's no process. There's no models, there's no precedent discussion. It's all like out here, and it's kind of frustrating. And I would recommend to the thesis advisors to actually make that a mandate. Something where we can actually look at it in 3D. It's so difficult for me to see it. Now I know this is not, maybe you were told not to do it, I don't know.
They're prohibited.
They're prohibited from
I was
exploring.
banned.
It seems that way, Brian. It's unfortunate. It seems like you guys are prohibited from showing process and doing models. And so it's something. It's not a critique of you. It's really a critique of how this process is done. And it's very frustrating to sit here and being sort of my head being held in one position to look at something. Yes, it is.
I agree, and I actually almost went through my 5 drawers of trace paper
You should have done
to
it,
pin some
and
stuff up.
make
and
it
I
messy.
just didn't.
But it is a very difficult project. Let's talk about your project. I really think you've got some opportunities here, and this is what you do for your portfolio. You do critiques of your work. I always say this is not done, and it will never be done. We all design our thesis over and over. But I agree. I think that if you look at your project, just sit back and look at it and say, what is the nature of this wall in terms of making a moat? And what is the nature of that space there? What did you actually get from, why isn't that punctured? And so I think you should go over this with some trace and say, what is the critique of it? I think you've got a difficult problem, but I I would just really step back and say, what am I making here?
Yeah.
What am I making?
Yes, it's a difficult problem, but I love the clarity and your direction, and you know what brings people together. Food always brings people together, so you have market, and then plazas, open public spaces, and you're incorporating everything together. Yeah, it's not perfect, but it's clear, and it gives you a very good direction.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I want to piggyback on Eric's comment about the sort of width here.
Yeah.
And I'd love to know whether you at any point, so you've already manipulated the train. Had you thought about manipulating it further, stretching it further, having gaps and stairs that go up the middle?
Yes.
Making it sort of, what if, I keep thinking, what if it was sort of two canopies? What if there were two canopies here, and each of them was then allowed to sort of travel around their portion and actually tie that architecture together? Because right now they're so disconnected from the buildings.
Yeah.
And I think if your idea is to really pull the east and the west side together, all you've done right now is sort of make at least a visual barrier. That's a very different type of architecture. And if that facade treatment, which I agree is very compelling, were to wrap these other buildings, then I think you almost would have made it easier on yourself, right? You could have said, okay, now I'm going to make sort of these two U's, and they come together underneath, and then there's a gap in the middle that lets the light down into it.
Yeah, so I did look at like making this facade express similarly to that canopy, and it just, when looking at it, got way too busy, and it really took away. I wanted the canopy to have a different character and a special character to these buildings, which were more massive and grounded, rather than this light canopy, which is why I moved forward with that, but I definitely did try.
Yeah, maybe even it's just the round columns, and so you continue the round columns around, but there's a different treatment as you get higher up, or it just, right now, it feels like that they're very disconnected. I agree with everything that's been said. To piggyback on Eric's point about process, I think there's a beautiful urban design sketch, Noli plan, that we're not seeing, that perhaps would suggest that you do go westward. And the fact that you put a civic building across the street, but then you don't connect to it, I could imagine there's some kind of bridge structure that takes cues from the train track structure. If I'm driving down this road, I don't know what the speed limit is there, but I'm going to say, okay, oh, that's cool. Yeah, there's the train station. But there's nothing kind of giving a big announcement that there's this huge civic space. So again, critiquing your thesis and going back to it, I would, go back to sketches. The program is kind of undercooked anyway, so I would just say focus on the big idea, which is the civic plaza space that you've made, which I think needs more green. I think it needs more kind of weaving this way. It's very striated this way. I think perforating this platform and bringing, a lot more light down into that space below. Those are always, that's, you sort of suggested you're moving against the train tracks being a divider. So that space and what it feels like to be under there is really critical. And I don't see, just correct me if I'm wrong, do I see a perspective or a section? Yeah, so, it could be a gallery space, but it could also be pop-ups or, artist studios or something a little bit more gritty.
Yeah, so I did look at kind of populating the underside of that tracks with actual built program, and every time I drew it, I just felt like I was drawing that wall again in between the two sides where I wanted to just sort of keep it really open.
I
think going back to the elevations, again, there is a lot of opportunity for sort of pushing these a little further in the next round. The buildings that you have to the left, those elevations feel very boxy and underdeveloped. I'm not sure you're getting much from the columns on the outside, and I'm wondering maybe that's another opportunity to bring people down the ground level into a space and not just into a kind of shadowy space.
Yeah.
And then I like the scale of the columns on the kind of right part of the plaza, but I wonder if there's kind of some thoughtful ways to think about how those touch the ground and how those touch the ceiling plane. You've got these perspectives where you're starting to show those things, but like, what does that underside of the ceiling surface look like? What does that parapet look like? How are you, maybe that's the next round, but, and are they stone, are they concrete, like what are those?
They're concrete.
Yeah, I could imagine a really beautiful stone on those too, something that's kind of a little more gracious than concrete. And I think you probably played with some of that. Even looking over here, I think the columns look like they come up and do they end there, or are we missing a beam that comes across?
We are missing a beam there, I'm going to be honest.
Yeah, that's okay. It's like something got turned off and on, right? But that's that means there's an opportunity there.
Yeah, exactly.
There's some opportunity for push and pull and how those things.
Yeah.
Did you? I was just gonna. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. I was just gonna say, lacking the physics. So I do think I agree with the process comments. I also think just for the sake of your project in particular, probably more so than many of them, a physical model can do a lot of good.
I agree.
Because this project, you need to be able to like dive in and kind of like daydream a little bit as you're describing it. So. But then again, I get where we're at in life, and like we don't get physical models as much anymore. Lacking that, you also have a project that's all about motion and transportation, and people coming and going, the trains pulling in, pulling out, people going from one side of the tracks to the other. Lacking an actual physical model, I would have loved to have seen some sort of like three-dimensional fly-through, some kind of walkthrough, some kind of animation, something that gives me a bit more of the experiential quality of what you're trying to communicate.
Yep.
So just from a presentation and trying to sell the project,
Yeah.
I think that would have done you a lot of good here.
I would have loved that. That was the dream.
I really like it. I think it's very well done. That said, did you consider, so when I look at this, you talk about the inequity between the west side and the east side, and yet when I look at the design, it looks like the west side, or the east side, wins again, in some ways, right? So did you look at something like, instead of a linear passing underneath, a circular passing, which gives equal space to both sides of the track? Did you play around with other shapes for that at all?
I didn't look at making that a circle. I looked at a lot of other things, but I didn't look at making that whole thing a circle.
With buildings that then almost become like the roundhouses in a turntable or something like that, that again gets the same level of space and sort of equity on both sides. Just something to, again, to think about as you explore in the future.
Yeah, just a second.
One of the things, Emily, too, I think that would be helpful to portray is the promenade that this initiates to the boardwalk. Now, I'm like the only Jersey guy that's never been to the shore. Okay? Never been.
Can you even call yourself a Jersey guy?
I guess I don't even have an accent where I come from. So, but I think that if you were to kind of connect with that as well, that one of the things I think would happen is the character of this thing might become more enlivened. I can imagine this being a very celebratory thing for you to get off the train and have a beach bag with you, whatever people do when they go to the beach. This is a foreign thing for me. Boardwalk, sure. But it just strikes me as that the next level of development would be the sort of loosening up, and that would help, I think, a lot with the questions about the character of the plaza, which is a good diagram, but now it needs something to sort of act as a kind of fabric softener to get it be very lively. Even this canopy that's overhead might have some kind of roll to it, so that it has some kind of aspect of you're getting off at a really special station to go to the shore. I have to say that 3 times.
You wanted
The Jersey Shore.
you were reaching for this.
I was pointing to the drawing.
I think you were pointing at the
He was
drawing.
showing me a drawing that he had already done the circle.
Can't go Piazza del Campo in Siena. Go look at it. Basically, let's make a bowl. But I think you've got an excellent. Again, it's a challenging project, and we're being critical because that's our job. But we're trying to say, look, how do you get to this next level? How do you put the fabric softener in there? That's always a challenge. Rigor and then relaxation, order, disorder. But anyway, I think your section, that longitudinal section, not the cross section, this cross section is fantastic. I mean, that is an incredible section. I look at it and there's so much going on, and you need to take the energy and whatever you got to that and put it into that. And so that would be my challenge.
Also, you're not helping yourself by the angle of it because it's compressing. I mean, it makes it feel like it's very heavy over top of it. So if you were to take the vantage point lower, I think it would really help.
Yeah, I played around with that a lot.
So two things. One, I really appreciate the fact that you have a winter scene because most often I think people think of things in the summer when the grass is green, the skies are blue, and it's wonderful. But as you mentioned, this is a tourist place too, where people come in the summer. So I think it's really important to think about it for those folks that are here year-round and what your spaces are going to be like when they're dead, the trees are dead and they're not full of life, and how else you can invigorate them. Separately, I think you said something about Scandinavia at the beginning, yes? So I would challenge you to think about this structure coming off of our last review as all wood, and not something that is a typical civic, heavy stone or concrete or brick aesthetic and tectonic. There is something that to be learned from, of course, the Scandinavian and wood structure that you sort of allude to in the lightness of the canopy above the tracks themselves, but I think could be something that ties you to the boardwalk as well, and that more relaxed feel or essence to it. It doesn't, you don't have to be hard and solid to be civic.
Yeah, I did try that a few times. I looked at that, and it was honestly because of all the moisture in the air and like being right by the ocean that I stepped away from wood. But I definitely agree with that.
Can you talk a little bit about the elevator piece? You talked about it sort of as this beacon. It feels a little kind of small in the aerial elevation here, but can you talk about how you thought about the massing of that?
Yeah, so that's something that I would like to move forward with more, for sure. But that kind of came as this idea that, in the city's master plan, they do talk about wanting a beacon for the city to sort of announce your presence there. So trying to incorporate that in and also have it be in the middle of this space that, that's the beacon, but it's in the middle and it draws everyone in. Recently talked about kind of creating these as two solid walls that run like these walls to sort of draw you through more and create more of a solid facade along here and the opposite side so that it reaches up more. That would be my next step, is developing that more.
I also wonder if there's an opportunity to open any of that space at the top. And maybe you're doing that on the sides of the plazas already, so it's unnecessary to have another one. But it's kind of cool to be able to be at the top of public spaces like that and see how, to Brian's point, talking about the first step on a journey to the beach. It'd be really cool if you could kind of get up high and see pretty far.
Yeah.
I think there's opportunity there.
This may sound like a practical point, but if I can't navigate stairs, how do I get to the
So
space?
there is this ramping system.
I mean from this side.
From the west side?
Yeah.
So you would take the elevator and go around.
Because I think the reality of that and wanting to, it's important to keep people together, not necessarily separate folks like my parents who don't need the elevator, but they can do a ramp. So I think that really could have informed your space and perhaps even more suggested that it move west and perhaps go under the street.
Yeah, I agree.
precedent for you to look at. Pioneer Square in Portland, you seen it?
No.
You gotta go look at it.
All
It
right.
does exactly what you want. Anyway, it's-
Good to know. I'll look at it.
Portland.
Well, I want to thank Emily for bringing this thesis to us. I think the comments really touched on a variety of scales, from kind of the party to the urban gesture, the connection to the beach, all the way down to kind of material choice and detailing. And I think that's the hallmark of a good thesis. What could be better than spending a month in Scandinavia with Carl Dupuy and a dozen or so graduate students? And I think in some ways maybe some of the thinking started there and back in Florence as well. I think the comments you received were great. Michael and Suzanne's comments about just kind of the clarity of the project, I think were very useful. And I really appreciate Eric's comments. I think these, well, first I want to say I've never been accused of telling students not to make models. I don't think you were doing that. Anyone who knows me knows I love models. And what I like so much about Eric's comments is that it talks about process, both looking backward and forward. And so I think to all the students out there that are listening, bringing some of that process that we know is tucked back in the studio out to your presentations is useful, but also maintaining a fresh and critical perspective on what you've done and looking to the future is a very healthy attitude, and one that we know that you have, and so we're looking for what you're going to bring to the profession in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you.